Thank you. And I have a hunch that I should be buying this, and instead of how to poison your spouse, it should be how to poison my editors. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Now, the first thing I want to say is that 99 and 9/10% of everything that Peter said about TV applies to print, and 99 and 9/10% of everything he mentioned I agree with. There are just a couple little fiddly bits. So I'll comment on those. And then my plan is, because he has saved me all the trouble of having to talk about how stories are selected and all the fiddly bits in a newsroom, I think what I will do, because it's absolutely the same, it really is, those points are absolutely right on the mark when it comes to print as well as the electronic media. I think I'll just give you a few general observations about news and science journalism as it fits in with that, and tell you a little bit about a guy named Prague O'neill, who was this year's Australian and Fresh Science Young Scientist of the Year. And then I'll tell you a few horror stories. Now, you'll probably have to grab me, Peter, because once I get on a roll with the horror stories, I need to vent my spleen. Now, the first thing, just following up on what Rob was saying, bias. I think that's very easy. To me, there's no problem about bias and reporting. I agree absolutely with what Peter Doherty said. You don't give equal time to Nazis. It's as simple as that. Don't fuss with them. Secondly, letters to the editor. Now, I understand the point that Rob was making, but I think that the bias that he was alluding to comes more from the bias of readers self-selecting what newspapers they're going to read. For instance, I know quite well how the letters editor works at the Australian and at the Sydney Morning Herald, where I worked for a while as well. And they genuinely, what they put in the paper reflects what people write in about. So the topic that gets the most space on the letters page is in fact the topic that most people have written in about. And believe it or not, the balance of the pros and the cons they put in does reflect what the readers say. The real question, I think, is how, and Rob mentioned this as well, how newspapers are going to start migrating to the web. And I think that's beginning to happen at the Australian. And I sincerely hope it happens soon because, for instance, remember the wonderful DNA story, the Neanderthal DNA? We didn't run it. Not because I didn't write it, we didn't run it. And I'll tell you more about why that came to be a little bit later on. Fluffy animals. Oh, they're fabulous. I think we should have animals in every newspaper. Everyone would buy them. And in fact, there is a person who works on the web team at the Australian, which is now becoming far more professional, I must say. We've got a really snappy young guy coming in, and I love seeing him fight with the paper editors and when they're saying, oh no, we have to save it for the readers tomorrow, and he's saying, we have to give something to our readers to read now. And oh, well, that's a shock. Anyway, we have a person whose job is to find cute animal pictures. She sends them to me. She's my friend. Breakthroughs. I detest the word as well. It is appalling. It is the most disgusting, vile swear word. If I ever see one used, I go hysterical. But I must point out, I think that the trend of reporters using the word is pretty well over with. Where we see the most are in press releases. I don't get a single press release that doesn't have a breakthrough or a fantastic development or the first and the best and everything that Rob was talking about. So it's not so much us, it's what we're getting these days, and we're getting it from largely incompetent, unqualified PR people, and I don't know why they get paid huge swags of money to waste my time. There were a couple of other things he mentioned, fluffy animals. Oh, I know it. You know, how stories are selected, how stories should be selected on the basis of their merit, and whether a good science story gets in or a newsy science story gets in made me think I had a huge fight with one of the editors about another story that didn't get in. But there was a really good angle on this one because I'd written the story, I had filed the story. They did not run the story, and it got a big splash in the Sydney Morning Herald, so they blamed me for them not running the story, at which point we had a screaming row. Again, this is why I think I'm going to buy a copy of this book. And I said, I thought stories ran on the basis of their merit. And he said, not necessarily. And that will come to one of the key points I may want to make. So again, back to some of the general observations I did want to raise today, because you are a skeptical audience, I thought it was important to make a couple of points about journalism generally, for starters. And that is, I know you will find this incredibly difficult to believe, but some of the most ethical, socially motivated people I have ever met are journalists. They get into journalism because, and I know it sounds trite, they want to do good. They want to make a difference. They really, really do. Now, of course, as in any group of people, there are slime buggers and monsters, but if you compare, surprisingly, the average journalist with the average politician, one's really trying to accomplish something, believe it or not. One is trying to accomplish something for themselves. So I know this is a shock, but it is in fact true. I mean, some of the most honest people I've also met are journalists. Within that cadre, science journalists, when you become a specialist, we do care, we care. We want to get it right. The notion that people are out there just to grab headlines and beat things up and get their name up front, well, there's a certain amount of that, as there would be in any business, I'm sure, but it's very, very small when it comes to the people that stay in science journalism. There was one person who did work in the field for a while and was continually indulging in this. That person isn't working in newspapers anymore. So there really is a sense that we're here fighting because it's a new kid on the block. And this is one of the other things I wanted to mention. Science is new to Australia. Although the ABC has been fantastic, it's new to the commercial world. That means that newspapers, in particular commercial outlets, have to figure out how to work science into their daily coverage. And again, news is subjective, so decisions are made on the basis of subjective opinion, and that works at several levels. Now, for instance, at the Australian, the general corporate culture says that what is news is politics, economics, business, not really sports, because there's a section for it, lots and lots of crime in courts, a bit of Hollywood celebrity, and if there's anything left over, then we might do a science story there. But they're not usually discovery science stories or developments in science stories. They tend to be stories of some news angle that involves science or scientists. I can talk a little bit more about that later if you want. But the idea here that I'm trying to get across is that science has to be the first thing into the front section of the newspaper if it wants to get in the paper the next day. It's also the first thing pulled out or the first thing that's cut, like the Neanderthal DNA story. Then another thing, if you want to compare the Australian to the Sydney Morning Herald, they use science as a change of pace. So in the Sydney Morning Herald, you see a lot of science stories given a lot of space. And that's because they use it in a particular way in the mix. We don't do that, they do that. So Deborah Smith gets a lot of stories in, I don't. When it came to the Neanderthal DNA story, I went to this very same editor that I'd fought with before because he's kind of at the top of the pecking order, and if I can get it past him, the chances are I might get it in. And I went to him to talk about several very good stories and to say, listen, I've got this awful problem. I can't, how are we going to get everything in? And he said, DNA stories, Neanderthal, and yes. And I can guarantee you Deborah Smith's going to have that tomorrow with a graphic. And they're also going to have a picture from the Australian Museum where there was a press conference this morning that I attended. And you pulled the camera to go and take a picture of John Howard. And so, yes, the next day, page 5, huge picture from the Australian Museum's fantastic collection of mammal specimens. And nice story about the Neanderthal DNA. I was wrong, she didn't have a graphic, she used a picture instead. And what did we have? nothing. We had nothing. Because the editors made the decision that there wasn't room. There was too much news. There wasn't room for the science story. It's not part of the daily mix. So that's something that I bump up against every single day. Another point I want to make is that it's amazing. I mean, it is absolutely amazing that anything gets out and it's accurate when you consider what has to happen and the pace at which it has to happen to get a daily newspaper together. Things have to be written, researched. They have to go through a writer, they have to go through a discussion process. Once I push send, my story goes off into another world altogether. And then there are about 4 different editors that look at it. They'll start cutting and chopping to make sure it fits. This is assuming the story is going to go in and it's going up front in the news pages. And at the very, very end of the day, and I use that phrase absolutely advisedly, at the end of the day, I don't know what's going to come out. I have no idea until I look at it the next day in the paper or don't look at it the next day in the paper. But the point being here that there are so many people that have their hands on something and they're not trying to make a mistake. They're trying to do their job. They're trying to pick up spelling errors or stylistic errors. They have to fit it into a certain space that's predetermined. Doesn't matter what the content is, it just has to fit the space, or it has to go completely. So when something comes out and there is a small error, it's not intentional in most instances. It's just something that's happened in the process. So everyone goes, oh yeah, it happened in editing. Well, it probably did. So please have a certain amount of tolerance for the tiny little fiddly bits that do go wrong, and remember that everyone is honestly trying to get it right. And that brings me to Prague O'neill, who was our Young Scientist of the Year. And because he won this contest, his prize was 2 weeks in purgatory in the newsroom with me. He finished on Friday. Craig is a geophysicist at Macquarie University, and he had a week of media training, the kind of thing that Rob was talking about, where you really start to understand how newsrooms, whether they're electronic or print, operate. So he had a real introduction to it when he arrived. And the first thing I did was get him working on some stories to see how it goes. And he managed to get 2 stories in, which is huge accomplishment. But I also asked him if he would write me some notes to read to you, because he finished yesterday, about what his experience was like. So I'll just read a couple of paragraphs. He says, Hobbes once said life was nasty, brutish, and short. I pretty much figured that was what a newsroom was like, so when I turned up, I was pleasantly surprised. It's fast, it's short, both in terms of time and space when you're writing, but it's not what I'd call nasty. Geochemists are a lot worse. One thing that really stood out was the integrity of reporting. I guess I'd seen far too much Mike Moore in Frontline. While the first impression sticks when dealing with the media, these people, at least at the Australian, take getting things right very, very seriously. And he had a terrible run-in with this getting it right business. The time scales are one of the hardest things to get used to. Rather than spend 3 months on a paper getting the wording perfect, you have max 1 day to write it up, verify the facts, get the competing statements, make some sort of sense out of experts. Waffling on in all direction, that's bloody hard. I come to dread having to get quotes from academics in a hurry. The languid academic response time to a story that had to be filled in an hour ago was really painful. Worse still is getting statements from government agencies. And he says to me, you know who I'm talking about. Fighting bureaucracy is something you need to do, and news doesn't have that luxury. The editorial decision process, I sort of expected that. Not quite the focus on Australian politics that seems to exist. It's somewhat of a religion, and let's face it, politicians aren't very exciting people, normally sex scandals aside, so it's the fixation at the Australian I don't really get. It's hard getting science press coverage, but that's a common anthem anywhere, and part of a deeply ingrained perception problem that goes far beyond the news desk. It does make you cry, though, in major breakthroughs like the Neanderthal genome, which interests people, and our huge science gets shunted for bloody local politics that will be forgotten in 5 years. So that's from the point of view of a scientist who was in a newsroom, and I think what he does is support some of the general comments that I wanted to make. Now, let's see, how's our time here? Not too bad. Because what I want to do is have a bit of a chat with you about how we can solve some of the problems of getting science past news editors and into a paper. Because on a daily basis, this is the news list for Friday. These are just the news stories in the front pages of the Australian. These are the stories that are competing for space. They're huge, and you can see there's the Canberra Bureau, Sydney Bureau, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, and there are also independent bureaus like Townsville. All of these are stories that are competing for space. Almost all of these stories are about politics, business, economics, scandals, and crime. There was one science story listed. And when I left, it was going to run, but it wasn't a science story as most people understand it. It was a research story, but it was also about health. Health almost always gets a run. If you're the medical reporter at any newspaper, your life is so easy. You just you know, the press releases come in, you rewrite them, you get a couple of quotes, and you're done. You go to lunch. If you're the science writer, you fight, and you fight. I'll tell you about Wednesday, the day of the Neanderthal tragedy. There were several very, very good things that were happening. And unfortunately, they were all pegged to a specific day. There was first the story coming out in both Science and Nature about the fact that researchers had managed to extract and analyze, sequence huge swags of DNA from a Neanderthal specimen, 38,000 years old. Wonderful story. And not only were they able to do that, it pretty well put paid to the argument that we descended from Neanderthals, that they were somewhere between us and our early ancestors, or that there was a lot of interspecies hanky-panky going on. Great story, lots of interesting angles to it, had to go. Top story, made it everywhere, front page around the world, didn't make it to the Australian at all, although it did make it to the website. There was another really, really good story. And it had to do with, it was a journal story, so that meant it was pegged, it had to go out the next day. And it was about a really interesting discovery regarding medieval Islamic sabers, the kinds that the Muslims used to beat the Crusaders out. You know, these swords are legendary for their sharpness. Now, what made the Islamic swordsmiths so good? Well, some clever scientists figured out that by chance in the forging processes, what they had done was built in nanocarbon wires and carbon tubes. And Prague O'neill was really interested in this. And I said, that's a great story. Why don't you phone around and see if you can find a saber? And we could get a fantastic picture. You could talk to the armorer who's taking care of the saber, and we could have a great way to tell this story. So he did, he rang around and he found that at the Powerhouse Museum, they have what is probably the only appropriately medieval sword made by these types of sword makers. And even better, it was made by the very same swordsmith who made the blade that they analyzed to come up with their conclusions. Fantastic. So that's all lined up. Craig has stories, wonderful stories. Oh, everybody loves this story. Everybody loves the Neanderthal story. Then there's a third story. It is, Rob, pay attention to the stem cell story. But it was about real findings with stem cells. And it was, again, published in a journal. And one of the things that was so compelling about this story that I thought we really should run it is it's a health story. Yes, health stories get a good run. There's going to be a vote in the House of Reps week after next. We want to keep stem cells as an issue alive in the readers' minds. And third, it was about work with a very obscure form of adult stem cell. And the works with animals suggested that there might very well be, this wasn't just sheer speculation, there might very well be a simple, comparatively simple treatment for muscular dystrophy, all 20 kinds. Now that's important. There was also the press conference at the Australian Museum with the State Arts Minister, Bob Debus. And that wasn't particularly interesting except that we were going to have access to the collections for photographic purposes, which is always fantastic, as people who read the Sydney Morning Herald found on page 5. And also it was a chance to talk to the minister about a news story that I had been pursuing, and that is the mergers, the proposed mergers of two of the country's leading museums, the Australian Museum and the Powerhouse Museum. There's a lot of anxiety about this, and for very good reason. And I wanted to talk to the minister and see what his point of view about it was. So we had arranged, Craig and I were going to be there, we'd arranged a photographer. We get there, find out the photographer's been pulled, as I said, to go and take a picture of John Howard, and that photograph was never used anywhere in the paper. So back we go to the newsroom, and I had a long talk with the editor, the guy at the top of the heap who makes the key decisions, and I said, listen, this is a real problem. What do you think we should do? And he said, okay, I think DNA, Neanderthal DNA is the main story. Do that at what we call a page lead link, which means a longer story, not just one of those little things down at the bottom. And we'll have a graphic showing the new way, or what this means in terms of the patterns of human evolution. Then we'll have a shorter story that will run on page 3, a few hundred words about the stem cell research, and we love the picture with the saber, and we love that story. We'll run that. And can we hold something from the Australian Museum? I said yes, because the Herald doesn't do political science stories. They just do straight science coverage. So I think we can get away with that. Next day, nothing ran. Nothing. And the reason it didn't run was there was no room. So science is always last. If there's room for science, there you go. And I'll end with one final war story, and this was the story of Friday's paper. And just as an aside, I brought with me Friday's paper, in which you don't see any science, not a twit of it, in the news pages up front. It's all the usual hoo-ha, Swiss banks, Abbott, Iraq violence, radio fraud, blah, 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 blah. But there is science. And it's in an unlikely place, which means that because it's so hard to get science in the upfront news pages, I have to spend an awful lot of time working for other sections I'm not employed to work for, or I'd never get anything in the paper, and how satisfying would that be? So I write features, I put things elsewhere, and there's, in this special travel supplement on Europe, of all things, there's a piece I wrote in here about Carl Linnaeus in Sweden. So where you take every opportunity you can to get in. I do a lot of TV reviews as well for that reason. But Friday, okay, so Friday, I'd been promised that I was going to get 1,200 words on an issue related to the stem cell debate for the Inquirer section, and I thought it was a fantastic story about a patent in the US. There are 3 of them, that essentially these guys have patented your embryonic stem cells. If you want to do anything with them, even the ones you've created yourself, ladies, you have to pay big time. Now, I think this is quite interesting, and I was beavering away on this feature and helping Craig get his stuff together. It's his last day. We're trying to squeak in the health story that was supposed to be in the paper. I haven't seen it yet today. And just as I was messaging to the section editor saying it'll be to you, in about 5 minutes, he messaged back and said, sorry, space been pulled. So a feature, 1,200-word feature I'd busted my ass on all day, has been pulled. It's not going to run, it's not in the paper today. So what I have to do now is try to find a way to put that material elsewhere. So this is what I spend a lot of time doing. And that's why I'm hoping that clever skeptics that you are, you can help me think of ways to work within those cultural constraints, to try to shape the attitudes of editors who are really, really busy. They're trying to get the best news out, but it's the best news that they see it, as they see it. And as they see news, it's defined as Canberra politics and all the usual boys stuff, you know, all that. They get really excited about this stuff. Yeah. What is it with Debus? Was there really going to be some kind of was he involved in those allegations? By the way, remember they pulled the camera that would have been with Debus? Small problem. They never think that the science reporter might have something to say that's relevant to the news cycle. They don't listen because they don't believe in their hearts that it's really news. I think it's interesting. People will stand around and talk about this stuff. They'll go on about it in conferences, but they won't run it because they come from a corporate culture in which news is first and foremost politics. That's the most important, and that's where you throw your effort. And just the final comment I'll make before hopefully we'll have time for a little bit of question and to and fro, and maybe Rob can come back and we could batter around some ideas, is that when you're thinking about news, I don't know how to get around this kind of thing. It's like turning the Titanic. This is a really embedded cultural system. And even though the Australian, the Herald, the Age, the Adelaide Advertiser are all different outfits, they run on virtually the same cultural system. What they have, the values are very much the same. How they interpret them shift slightly. So trying to break that is a problem. And again, if you guys can offer me any suggestions about that, I would be more than welcome. And one final point, and I should have mentioned this up at the top, I think, because it relates to the Australian Science Museum Centre, which has been set up, as Rob said. And I think the way that was set up shows that in Australia we're in a different position than reporters are elsewhere. I'm fighting this very battle for space, just trying to get it in up front and to have people think it's important. But elsewhere it's not like that. In the United Kingdom, the reason that the Science Centre was set up was because there was lots of concern that there were huge errors in the science reporting. They were having, you know, Franken monsters and Franken foods and just over-the-top science reporting. They weren't having the problem of getting it in. They were having the problem of it being so popular, it was being used widely and it was being used incorrectly. So that's my final thought. And are there, therefore, any questions? And Rob, where are you sitting? You could come on back and we could have a chat about it. I see a hand in the back. Yes, the lady in the back. Yeah.
Okay. I've noticed, because I've been watching in an area of that I have some knowledge, that the headlines and above stories often don't really reflect what's in the stories.
That's because they're written by separate people.
Do you write your own headlines?
No.
Who does?
They have, the sub-editors do.
Yeah. And do you find that sometimes happens, that what the sub-editor writes?
Depends on the newspaper. For instance, in the Australian, no, because they're purporting to be an intellectual broadsheet. But in some of the tabloids, the headlines bear no relationship to the story. The story's accurate, but the headline's completely off the plot.
My information was with the Courier Mail, and the topic was education.
Yeah.
There seems to be a big mismatch sometimes.
Yeah, that does happen, and it's unfortunate, but we humble reporters do not have any say over that.
Sub-editors don't get given agendas that you've got to put this sort of spin on the story.
Oh,
so
well,
you make the headline.
Yeah, I mean, spin's an interesting thing. It comes at a very abstract level. For instance, the Murdoch-owned papers are very right-wing. That is assumed. The tabloid papers are out to outrage. That is assumed. So people do work that way. Yes, absolutely. Now, lady in the far back. Yeah.
Leigh, we don't have a local Fairfax paper in Tasmania, so I'm really looking forward to reading your story about Neanderthal DNA. I didn't know about it.
It's on the web.
oh, that's good. But wouldn't the Australian then, if they missed it as a news story, wouldn't they be likely then to run it in the weekend also?
Oh, heavens no, then it's old news. We don't run things if it ran in an obscure newspaper. I mean, that's if it's science. It's double standard for science. You know, science stories have to be perfect. They have to be well written. They have to include everything. They have to be short. They can't talk down to anybody. They have to be absolutely new. None of, politics, that doesn't happen. But no, they wouldn't touch it in a fit because it's old news.
You always get published in the Skeptics.
Oh, the Skeptics are a fabulous outfit.
They're a personal friend of mine.
Ah, bias. Now, one final thought from the lady in the back.
Very quickly, what happens if you take your own digital camera along to an event, take your own photos, bring it back and say, I've got the photo anyway, even if you did pull the photographer?
I've done that, yeah. I often do it for things like travel pieces, like you will see in the Europe supplement. My pictures, without a byline. Yeah, I was there. He and I are like that. I'll tell you how it's done later. It's a very paranormal experience. Yes, in the back there. Sorry, we have lights in our eyes here. We can't really see.
Suggestion, I have one for you. Why don't you, with colleagues from your own paper and perhaps other papers, run an expose on the scientific qualifications, the background and the publishing record of all newspapers in Australia?
Who would run it?
What else can you do? Your website.
I think it would be a great idea, but I'd be fired. And I have entered the mortgage belt now. Yes, down front.
Leigh, listening to you in your talk...
Oh, it's Willis.
It's
I
Willis.
couldn't even
it's
see
Willis.
who you were.
Maybe
Sorry.
it was all the dope I smoked when I was younger, but I had an incredible flashback that was very vivid of Bob Beale giving exactly the same talk as you've just given 10 years ago.
Yeah.
What's happened in the last 10 years? Have we got anywhere?
I think we have. We've moved away from breakthroughs. And back when I worked with Bob Beale at the Herald, Julian Cribb was the science writer at the Australian, and he was one of the first in the commercial world. It was Bob and it was Julian that really got things going after the ABC, with Pockers and Williams getting things up and running. So back when I was working with Bob, Julian was my off-siter, and he had more stories in the paper about new research from the CSIRO. He was known as the guy who could, and I'm not being, nasty in any way, shape, or form. This is telling you where things were. He was known as the guy who could do the fastest turnaround of a CSIRO press release. Those days are gone. We don't do gee whiz, isn't it so stuff in the paper anymore. You just don't see it in the mainstream papers. Deb Smith at the Herald is focusing on, concrete science advances. She'll do some in-depth looks at things like nanotechnology. Those sorts of things didn't happen before. At the Australian, I try to cover the news of science, whether it's what's the politics behind stem cells. It's not just, hello, these are stem cells. These are the things that scientists think they may do. So I think it is moving along, but it's really, really hard. There is a handful of people that are doing it. It's soul-destroying. I sometimes think that I am a victim of a subtle psychological experiment to see how much negative reinforcement one person can get before they go ballistic and kill people. So it's changed, but it hasn't changed far enough as far as I'm concerned.
Can I just add a little bit of that? There has been one paper that's changed, particularly this year, and that's the Advertiser, which has a number of things that haven't changed, we wish would. But the editor of that has been asked to be a board member of the Science Media Centre. We have noticed a very considerable change in the amount of science and the quality of science run there. Suddenly, it's got top editorial interest. And every Saturday, for example, there's a piece written by university scientists. Good pieces, too.
But they don't pay them.
No, they may not. But they're getting science. One thing at a time. But the other thing I think we should all be pushing for, a lot of people say, we ought to have science supplements the way they have arts, etc. Won't work. These things pay for themselves with advertising. Scientists don't advertise. But we should be pushing all media outlets to have even part-time science specialists. We need more people like Leigh to be arguing in the media for this and to have kindred spirits who argue and who can move from place to place if they get stuffed around for the one they work in. We do need to have science, medical, health specialists there because they have, as Leigh said, they have a vested interest in getting it right. The quality leaps sharply when you have a specialist on the job. The ordinary journalist hear science today, politics tomorrow, it doesn't much matter. They'll try not to get it wrong, but their reputation doesn't suffer in the same way. Can you just, in terms of getting things in, I used to tell people, aim for Monday and particularly go for January when half the staff are on leave, because it's much easier to get things in because they're not people looking.
That's absolutely true. I
Can
love
you
working
comment on
through the holidays. Yes, absolutely. I've even had front page stories over the holidays because the politicians are out of town. And Monday's a very good day because all of the big players are usually taking the day off. So if you're willing to work on Sunday, well, hey, you've got a chance. I write a lot of stories that I call Sunday for Monday stories, and you're absolutely right. That's a good trick. Yeah. Yeah, and another thing, I hate press releases. I loathe and despise them. I hate the fact that I have about 5 billion of them in my inbox every morning, followed up by a phone call from someone who doesn't even know my name. And you know, the other day I went through a phase where I said, all right, every time someone rings, I'm going to tell them about this in the nicest possible way. So someone rang and said, oh, yeah, and I'd sent you this. And I said, now where do you think that would go in the paper? Well, it'd be a nice feature. Where? Do you ever read our paper? No. They don't read the paper. They don't know who they're targeting. They have no suggestion about how that story can be used. In contrast, there are a handful of excellent PR people who do not send me things by and large. They'll ring me and they'll say something's happening, or in reverse, I will ring them because they're really, really good and they know their stuff and they're helpful. They're fantastic, but there are not very many of them.
One last question.
Yes.
Suggestion for scientists to increase the number of sex scandals. We could make all scientists believe.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Yeah, that's an excellent idea. A lot of smut, and if you can get, say, a ménage à trois with Robin Warren, Peter Doherty, and Barry Marshall, you're in front page stuff. Thank you. Sorted. Thanks all.